Rachel Reeves joined the Fabian Society when she was 18 years and 1 month old in March 1997. She was a leading light in the young Fabians, speaking and writing and organising then. Then, after 2010, when she became an MP, she joined the Fabian Society's executive committee during her time as a shadow minister under Ed Miliband's leadership. She's written frequently for the Fabian Society, not least her 2019 pamphlet, Everyday Socialism, where she brought people from across the left together to focus on where the agreements were on economic policy across the Labour movement. She's spoken at this conference and many other conferences organised by the Fabian Society numerous times. But this is a first for Rachel. It's the first time that she is the keynote opening speaker at a Fabian conference, and I'm delighted to welcome her to the stage.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you, Andy, for that kind introduction and for the leadership that you have shown this society through some difficult times over this last decade. Friends, what a pleasure it is to be with you here again this year. Now, this might come as a bit of a surprise, but I can't help but feeling it's been a slow start to the political year. After the procession in and out of number 10 and number 11 last year, it's the 21st of January, and I've still only faced one Chancellor of the Exchequer. Last year, I faced 4 in 6 months, and in fact, if Jeremy Hunt lasts all the way until the budget, he will be the longest-serving Chancellor of the Exchequer since the current Prime Minister. Now, as Andy says, I've been a Fabian for almost as long as I've been a member of the Labour Party. As secretary of the Young Fabians many years ago, I remember meetings in the old offices of the Fabian Society on Dartmouth Street and feeling a real connection to Fabian history. Every time that Labour has won power and achieved meaningful change for our country, the Fabian Society has been at the heart of that. Take one of my heroes, Beatrice Webb. As a social investigator, a reforming campaigner, and also as an economist, Webb spent a lifetime fighting to build an economy that works for working people, in the knowledge that this was not just a moral cause, though it is, but also the route to building a stronger and more prosperous country. As our economy and our society and our politics have changed, so must the solutions change too. And this morning, I want to tell you about how the next Labour government will bring that Fabian spirit to tackle the challenges ahead. Now, as we look to the next general election, the questions I think that the British public will be asking are simple ones. Are me and my family better off than we were 13 years ago? Do our hospitals, our schools and our police work better than they did 13 years ago? Frankly, does anything in our country work better than it did when the Conservatives came to office? And if the answer to these questions is no, then I think that you know that it is time for change. The Conservatives have brought our public services to breaking point. A couple of years ago, they were clapping our nurses, but with the NHS on the brink, their solution is to sack them for taking industrial action. The Tories crashed our economy, landed homeowners across the country with eye-watering increases in mortgage rates, and now they want to tell us that last year was all just some bad dream. And the Tories have presided over more than a decade of stagnant living standards. 13 wasted years. Never again let the Conservatives claim to be the party of sound economic management. Never again let them claim to be the party of aspiration, and never trust the Conservatives with our public services. And friends, to add insult to injury, this week they showed us the depth of their commitment to their own levelling up rhetoric. The Prime Minister gave the game away last year when he bragged about fiddling funding formulas to divert cash from the north to Tunbridge Wells. And then what did we get this week when the results of the Levelling Up Fund were announced? Money funnelled to Tory-held seats. £19 million to the Prime Minister's own constituency in Richmond. But nothing for the entire city of Leeds that I have the privilege of representing. It's not just that the Tories have failed in their efforts to level up the country. They haven't even bothered. And worst of all, it was clear that they never intended to either. Friends, it is time for change. It is time for a Labour government. We gather here today in the midst of a cost of living crisis. Now, while the causes of that crisis are largely global, our unique exposure to global events, pandemics, wars, economic crises too, is the result of choices of successive Conservative governments. Our present crisis is just one chapter in a longer story. More than a decade of weak growth, productivity, and pay, and of the erosion of Britain's economic resilience. The effects of Putin's war have reverberated around the world, and we will not waver in our support for Ukraine. But it wasn't Russia's invasion of Ukraine that caused home insulation rates to collapse. It wasn't Russia's invasion of Ukraine that caused a decade of inaction on investment in nuclear and new renewables. And it wasn't Russia's invasion of Ukraine that closed our gas storage facilities here in Britain. No, those are the consequences of a 13-year Tory experiment in unilateral energy disarmament, and we are all paying the price for that. We desperately need a plan to repair Britain's economic and energy security and to bring energy bills down. A plan to end our reliance on fossil fuels. But we also need a plan for the weeks and the months ahead. Because while the Prime Minister buries his head in the sand, for ordinary people, the cost of living crisis hasn't gone away. That is why we have called on the government to rule out any rise in fuel duty in the budget in March. Because it cannot be right that in a cost of living crisis, nurses driving from shift to shift, supermarket workers working through the night, and millions of people around the country without access to decent public transport, including Lord Roy Kennedy, should be left to face the biggest ever rise in petrol prices. And that is what will happen in March without action from the government. And today I can tell you more about the immediate action that we would take to address the consequences of the energy crisis that we face. Millions of households across Britain are looking at a 40% increase in their energy bills from April. In a week when temperatures fell below zero, I know that many families and pensioners will be acutely worried about what is happening. At the same time, energy giants continue to make record profits. Over the last year, the profits of North Sea oil and gas companies has tripled. That cannot be right. So today I can announce what a Labour government would do. We would hold to that most basic of principles, that those who have profited from the windfalls of war should share their part of the burden in reducing the cost for others. So ordinary people do not have to bear the brunt of a crisis that they did not cause. So we will extend the windfall tax, closing the fossil fuel investment loophole and taxing oil and gas giants at the same rate as which they're taxed in Norway. By backdating this to the start of 2022, when oil and gas companies were already beginning to make historically large profits, we can raise more than £13 billion. A Labour government would pass those savings on to families immediately to keep energy bills down this year. Our plans will save the typical household £500 on their energy bills from April, compared to the government's plans, by keeping the energy price guarantee at its current level of £2,500 rather than letting it rise to £3,000 in April. But let me be clear, this is a maximum. If wholesale prices fall, the cap must come down too. And it is a scandal that those with the least are often forced to pay the most for their energy. So Labour would eliminate the premium paid by those on prepayment meters, and the forced installation of prepayment meters all too often leads to the most vulnerable households going without heating entirely. So Labour is calling for a moratorium on that practice. And let me say to the companies who are doing this, it is wrong, it is punishing the most vulnerable, and under Labour it will not happen. That is a plan for today's crisis. But as Keir said earlier this month, sticking plaster politics is just not enough. We cannot persist from walking into crisis to crisis unprepared every time, and at the last minute producing hugely expensive fixes to get us through, while the underlying problems, those weakened foundations, go untouched. So we will take urgent action to help millions of households through the ongoing energy crisis, because we must do that. But Labour will act to get energy bills down for good. That is why Labour has a plan to reach 100% clean power by 2030 and retrofit millions of homes. These policies could save a typical household £1,400, generating savings not just for 1 year, but for every year to come. A response to today's crisis and a plan to prevent tomorrow's crisis. That is what a Labour government will do. Climate transition is a moral responsibility. We all know that. It is an economic necessity because the costs of action today are far less than the costs of acting tomorrow. And it is an opportunity because whatever ideologues on left and right might tell you, we do not have to choose between going green and going for growth. In the 2020s and the 2030s, those two things go hand in hand. Now, to some on the right, climate change is nothing more than a cost, or even a con. Some on the left, meanwhile, will claim that the only way to tackle the climate crisis is nothing short of a command economy or the overthrowing of capitalism itself. And then there are those on the fringes of the green movement who shudder at the very prospect of economic growth. I reject all those assessments and their ideological cul-de-sacs. More innovation, more investment, and more enterprise will be crucial to the green transition. And there is a global race on for the jobs and the industries that will power that transition. We do not have to choose between letting the planet burn or accepting a future of diminishing living standards in a poorer country. If these were the extent of our ambitions, we might as well give up now. Climate transition isn't about putting a lick of green paint on a stagnant and insecure economy. It's about new jobs. It's about new industries, lower bills and higher living standards, and economic growth too. Pro-worker, pro-business, and pro-climate. Now, we know that some country is going to lead in offshore wind, in green hydrogen, in carbon capture and storage, and so much more. Why not Britain? From Rolls-Royce developing carbon-neutral aviation in Derby, to Tread in Leeds, which has launched the UK's first green debit card, to Fife Renewables Innovation Centre, housing businesses at the frontier of the clean energy revolution. The potential is here in Britain. But in too many places and too many industries, it's going unrealised. Meanwhile, in the US, the Biden administration's Inflation Reduction Act has galvanised green energy. And at the World Economic Forum this week, Ursula von der Leyen announced plans for an EU Net Industry Act to allow European nations to compete. But our government is sat carping on the sidelines. Grant Shapps, the business secretary, says that these measures are dangerous. Well, I'll tell him what's dangerous. Doing nothing. The choice is simple. We can sit by while our peers steam ahead in the global race for the jobs and the industries of the future. Or we can use all the powers at our disposal to let British businesses and working people compete in that race. The choice is simple. That is why Labour's Green Prosperity Plan forms the very centrepiece of our economic policy. That is the choice that Labour will make, and that is what a Labour government will do. And this morning, I can tell you more about a core part of our Green Prosperity Plan. Our world-leading pledge to be the first major economy to have 100% zero-carbon power by 2030. Now, we don't make this pledge lightly. It will take choices, hard choices, that a Labour government would make in the national interest. Take just one example, our planning system. A system that is now defined by delay. It currently takes up to 13 years to develop a new offshore wind farm. Up to 4 of those years are spent fighting the planning system. The Hornsea 1 wind farm off the Yorkshire coast was commissioned under the last Labour government, but it didn't come online until 2019. It's cheap, clean power that now supplies 1 million homes. It couldn't be provided until years of bird data and other planning requirements had been collected and assessed. Since 2017, not a single offshore wind farm has been recommended for approval by the Planning Inspectorate. In every case, they have had to be overruled by the Secretary of State. But it adds further delays when that same Secretary of State lets that approval decision sit on their desk for almost 2 years, as they did with Hornsea 3, which will be the world's biggest wind farm when it is finally completed later this decade. Those delays are depriving a further 3.2 million homes from cheap, clean power. And that's before you consider the years that offshore wind farms have to wait to get a connection to the national grid, so that power can get from the North Sea to people's homes and people's businesses. This backlog has now got so bad that projects from the latest leasing round last year have been told that they will not get a grid connection until 2033, a decade's time. Meanwhile, what are the Conservatives doing? Reforming the planning system? Sorting out the grid backlogs? Not a bit of it. They're using these critical months and years to argue about whether they should continue to ban onshore wind completely or simply set up a special, uniquely restrictive planning regime for it instead. With Labour, that won't stand. If we're going to double onshore wind capacity, triple solar and quadruple offshore wind, all within the next 7 years, we will need to reform that planning system. We'd ensure that net zero is embedded through it and our whole energy system, bringing planning restrictions for onshore winds in line with other infrastructure. impose tough new planning targets on decisions on renewables and get it down from years to just months. Reform the grid system to cut the delays and get on with delivering clean power to turbocharge the transition. And ensure that these decisions are prioritised so that agencies can meet them. We'll look at how we can ensure that communities that host infrastructure in the national interest feel the benefit. And the farce of planning decisions languishing on ministers' desks will end, and we will crack down on Whitehall blocking developments and require local authorities to proactively identify land for renewable energy opportunities and improve access to data. We will remove those barriers wherever they are. That is what a Labour government will do. Now, that work is ongoing and it's led by Ed Miliband. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister has made clear his own depth of commitment to net zero this week, when he chose to fly from Teesside to Blackpool on an RAF jet. Now, I understand that the air stewards had to do the seatbelt demonstration several times before the Prime Minister finally got it. A Labour government will be different. When you look back on the next Labour government, I ask you to judge us on this. Are energy bills down for good? Is Britain more secure from the effects of global fluctuations in the energy market? Are we on course for net zero? Have we created hundreds of thousands of jobs in Britain, in new and growing industries, in our ports, our steel, in our industrial heartlands? I will campaign with everything I've got to be Chancellor in the next Labour government, and I will give you everything I've got as Labour's next Chancellor. And I make this pledge to you too, that I will be Britain's first Green Chancellor of the Exchequer. Our Green Prosperity Plan forms one part of a wider approach. The Tories may be stuck in the past, but around the world, economic common sense has moved on. Inequality does harm economic growth. Markets alone cannot deliver the strategic investment that we need. And as well as the successes of industries on the frontier, the state of our everyday economy, care, retail and more, is crucial to sustainable economic growth. To fail to learn these lessons is to follow the path of managed decline. The alternative is what US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen calls modern supply-side economics. It is based on the knowledge that strong and inclusive economic growth cannot be achieved without active government creating the foundations for a dynamic private sector to build upon. It is time for a British modern supply-side approach. Let me explain what I mean by that. It starts with the acceptance that neither of the big ideas which defined British economic policy over much of the last 80 years are adequate for the challenges that we face today. Because although we would be in a far better place today had the Tories a decade ago paid heed to Keynes's insights, Keynesian pump priming on the demand side does not hold the answers to stagflation. And supply-side problems require supply-side solutions. That was true in the 1970s, and it is true today. But the old supply-side economics were based on a misplaced faith that deregulation and tax cuts to the wealthiest would stimulate growth, and their benefits trickle down to everybody else. Not only did that approach widen inequality between people and places, it had diminishing returns for growth and productivity. The Liz Truss experiment was the last gasp of a failed economic philosophy. A modern supply-side approach means government taking a more strategic role to expand the productive capacity and the resilience of our economy. First, by providing catalytic investment and strategic partnership with business through our Green Prosperity Plan, our modern industrial strategy, led by Johnny Reynolds, and through the work of our Startup Review. Second, by boosting our labour supply, by supporting strong public services and helping people back into work. And third, by repairing our economic resilience, extending economic security with a real living wage and our New Deal for working people, led by the work of our Deputy Leader, Angela Rayner, and reducing our dependence on fragile international supply chains with our plans to buy, make and sell more here in Britain. Together, these plans comprise a modern supply-side economics, a new approach for economic growth felt in all parts of the United Kingdom. That is what a Labour government will do. Now, the success of this approach will require honesty about the limits of what national government can achieve alone. First, because we cannot achieve our ambitions with the pull of a lever in Whitehall. And so we will give local, regional and national leaders the powers they need to support thriving local economies. And second, because any government serious about growth and improving the supply-side capacity of our economy needs to fix the mess that is this government's Brexit deal and forge a closer trading relationship with the European Union. Look at the reality. Our agriculture and our food industries rely on trade right across Europe, but we have a deal that doesn't even include a veterinary agreement. We are pioneers in creative industries, but we have a deal that ties them in knots over visas. We are the second largest exporter of services anywhere in the world, but we have a deal that doesn't include the mutual recognition of professional qualifications. And we have the best universities in Europe, but we have a deal that cuts us out of the Horizon research programme. So we will fix the holes in the government's patchwork Brexit deal, and instead of picking needless fights with our nearest and largest trading partners, we will work together with our neighbours and our allies to get a deal that works for the British economy. That is what it means to stand up for the national interest. And one final thing. Modern supply-side economics recognises that a strong economy rests on strong public services. So be in no doubt, there will be no return to austerity. It has left our country poorer, our public services at breaking point, and our public finances in tatters. Labour will make sure that public services have the investment that they need, and reform too, to meet the challenges of an ageing society, to equip young people with the skills for a new and modern economy, and to seize opportunities presented by advances in artificial intelligence and robotics. Good public services must be paid for. Labour will not waver in our commitment to fiscal responsibility. I have been clear about the absolute importance of ensuring that every line in our next manifesto is fully costed and fully funded. So let me tell you what a Labour government will do. We will end the tax break, which exempts private schools from paying VAT and business rates. Because private schools are many things, but they're not charities. We will put that money where it belongs, into all of our children's futures and into our state schools. And we will end the non-dom tax status, because if you make Britain your home, you should pay your taxes here too. And under Labour, you will. We will put that money into one of the largest workforce expansions in the history of our National Health Service. More doctors, more nurses, more midwives and more health workers. Fabians, that is what a Labour government will do. I know that in the months ahead, many of you will be playing your part in making our shared ambitions a reality. Together, we will change Britain again in that Fabian spirit. We will rescue our public services after years of Tory neglect, restore economic security to working people, support British businesses to lead in the global race and build that fairer, greener future. That is what a Labour government will do, and be in no doubt that government is coming soon. Thank you. Thank you. I'll stay here, yeah. Thank you.
Rachel, thank you so much for that fantastic, inspiring speech, covering so much ground as well. Now we have some time for questions and answers. We're going to start with just a couple of questions from the media while the camera is still on. Is Nick from the BBC here? Nick, yeah.
Shadow Chancellor, thank you. I'm representing the pools. I've got a couple of questions for you, if that's okay. First off, Nadeem Zahawi, Dominic Raab has said this morning that the former Chancellor has been transparent about his tax affairs. What sort of response would you like to see from the Prime Minister? That's first of all. Secondly, the 78% on tax profits for oil and gas companies, which Labour supports, which you've talked about this morning, would that just be as a unique windfall, or is that what Labour would set as an ongoing rate in government? And lastly, Sajid Javid says charging for A&E and GP appointments is crucial to the survival of the NHS. Is he right?
Thanks very much for those questions, Nick. Well, Dominic Raab, who's being investigated for bullying, is passing judgment on Nadeem Zahawi, who's just had a £1 million fine for not paying his taxes on time. And that pretty much epitomises this Conservative cabinet. When the Prime Minister came into office, he said that he would run a government that would have honesty, integrity and professionalism at its heart. None of those three things are happening today. Last year, Nadeem Zahawi said that there was nothing to see when it came to his tax affairs. He wrote letters to, or his lawyers wrote letters to people saying that they should cease and desist in talking about his tax affairs. And the Prime Minister this week said that Nadeem Zahawi had been transparent when he hasn't actually answered a single question about his tax affairs. Now, this matters because a few months ago, he was Chancellor of the Exchequer. You may forget because there were 4 of them last year, but he was Chancellor of the Exchequer, responsible for Britain's tax affairs and tax collection, the taxes that we now find that he wasn't so keen to pay himself. So if the Prime Minister wants to stick by his commitment for integrity, honesty and professionalism, he should do the right thing and sack Nadeem Zahawi. On the issue of the tax rate for North Sea oil and gas, this is a response to the unprecedented situation that we find ourselves in at the moment, when a third of families in Britain are in fuel poverty. That's 8.4 million households. And as a result, we have to take extra measures to ensure that we can help them. And I've always been clear that I will not announce anything unless I can say where the money's going to come from, which is why we have put forward these proposals for a proper windfall tax, a rate at the same level as what you have in Norway, ending the fossil fuel allowance and backdating it to the beginning of last year when those profits started to accrue. But this is a temporary measure in response to the situation we find ourselves in, and we hope that as energy bills come down, people will be able to start paying their bills again. So this is a response to the crisis that we find ourselves in. Look, I don't think it will come to a surprise in anyone in this room that Labour are the party that are committed to a national health service that is free at the point of use. That is what we created in 1948, and that is what we will always fight for. And so, no, I do not agree with Sajid Javid's proposals to make people pay to see their GP. That is not the answer that we need, not in the cost of living crisis and not in an NHS crisis. Thank you very much for your questions, Nick.
One more question from a journalist. Is Amelia from Channel 4 here? Thanks.
Hello, thank you. Following allegations around Nadeem Zahawi's tax affairs, what action would you like to see taken? And do you think that MPs from any party should be allowed to use or benefit from offshore trusts?
Thanks very much for your question, Amelia. Look, Labour have been very clear that we would get rid of the non-dom tax status, but we would also crack down on the use on offshore trusts, because if you just do one without the other, you can still have a situation where people make their home here in Britain but are not paying their taxes here. And we've been very clear, under a Labour government, if Britain is your home, this is where you would pay your taxes, and we will crack down on the abuse of offshore tax funds and tax havens. Thanks for your question, Amelia.
Great. Let's go to, we'll have questions in groups of 3. I'll try and get a spread around the room. So can I see hands up who would like to ask a question? Let's see the woman there, the man in second row, and the woman at the back in black.
Thank you very much. Lucy Caldecott, Co-Vice Chair of the Fabian Women's Network. You quite rightly draw attention to the levelling up flagship policy of the government and the recent announcements which have been perceived as so unfair. What would Labour's approach be to levelling up this country, bearing in mind the complexities of inner city urban poverty as much as rural poverty, and not putting the burden on busy local authorities to compete against each other? Thank you.
I'm inspired by what you have said. What I'd like to ask about is trade policy, arms policy. Can we, because we import so much from abroad in countries which do not respect human rights, are not trying to go green, can we have something said about what our trade policy would be throughout the world, and also an ethical including green policy in where we sell arms, which is rather a large part of our economy?
Thank you. And then the woman at the top. Yeah. Oh, sorry, there's a mic coming to you, right at the top of the stairs. Even higher. Yeah. I'm making him run around.
I wanted to ask about Labour's planned approach to house building specifically. So we're barely managing to build around 200,000 homes a year. Somewhere like France is managing much more, like 400,000. We're not building enough homes, essentially, and young people are ending up trapped in expensive rented accommodation, unable to afford to buy. Both of those things should function properly. You should be able to rent a home and it should be affordable. You should be able to buy a home. What will Labour do to make sure that more houses can be built, especially making sure that that links then to growth? Because at the moment we've got the problem that people can't live where jobs often are, and that's then kind of causing problems with us being able to grow as much as we could.
Great, thank you. Rachel, 3 great questions.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, all of you, for those questions. In the answer to Lucy's question, Gordon Brown published a report commissioned by Keir Starmer in December, which called for much greater devolution of powers. And so instead of having this bidding war, as you say, local authorities are bidding against each other, regional leaders, local leaders would be given the resources to make choices that are in the best interests of their area. And actually the Conservative Mayor for the West Midlands, Andy Street, put that very well, I think just yesterday, when he has called for an end of the begging bowl culture of going to ministers and civil servants in Whitehall who've probably never been to the places where these bids come from and making decisions without that knowledge. And I think he's right about that, and that's why Gordon Brown in his report called for much greater devolution of skills, of housing, of transport, of job support, of energy as well, so that we can actually get things done, and the people who are closest to the decision, have skin in the game, are the ones who are making those decisions. In answer to the second question, look, Britain's trade with the rest of the world has fallen, and so has our foreign direct investment. In the years that we were in government, we secured 8% of global foreign direct investment into the UK. Under 13 years of Conservative, that's fallen to 4%, and in the most recent year, just 1.7%. So we've got to be there, out there on the international stage, securing investment and securing trade for British businesses. Now, of course, there'll always be limits to that, but at the moment, my focus would be doing more to help British businesses to export and to create the environment that businesses and investors want to do business and invest here in Britain. In answer to the final question about housing, the Conservatives once claimed to be the party of home ownership, but home ownership has now fallen to one of its lowest levels in decades, and precisely because we have not been building the houses. Labour have made commitments around house building, and also it relates to the earlier question from Lucy about devolving more power and sorting out, as with energy infrastructure, the planning infrastructure that makes it so difficult to get houses built. But also, you mentioned the issue of renters, and we've got to have a much better deal for renters who are often in very precarious situations, and people are renting now for much longer into their lives, families with children who have no security, and a Labour government would need to address those issues too. So thank you for that question.
Brilliant. We'll have, at least, I think, probably one more round of questions. Let me see some hands. So I'll go for so many to choose from. Sorry, I can't get to everyone. That man there. Then we'll go for the woman in the middle there. And on this side, we'll go for that man there.
Thank you. Given what happened last time Labour were in power, will the next Labour government abolish fractional reserve banking?
And the woman there.
Hi, Rachel. What's your policy on tuition fees?
Two very short questions. Give Rachel a chance there. And there's a bit of a run for you again up to the top with the, in the light-coloured jumper, a bit further up.
On the topic of regional devolution, have you explored or are you considering fiscal devolution to these different regions and local authorities?
Great, thank you, Rachel.
I am concerned about some of the things that the Conservative government are doing at the moment to potentially loosen the rules and regulations when it comes to financial services regulation. And it is important that we learn the lesson of the last crisis and ensure that banks are properly capitalised. But I also think we need to learn lessons of the most recent crisis and what we saw, for example, with the liability-driven investments crisis after the Truss and Kwasi mini budget last year, because the shadow banking sector remains much less regulated than the banking sector, and we saw the vulnerabilities in the markets last year. So I think there is more that needs to be done to protect people and to protect the macroeconomy from some of those risks. In terms of the second question, well, Keir was asked this question a few weeks ago. We know that the current system isn't working, and we know as well that many people will never pay back their debts, and that we've now have an increasingly regressive system where people who earn less over their lifetimes end up paying more than people who are on highest income. So the system is clearly in need of reform. But the truth is that an incoming Labour government are going to inherit public services, our schools and our hospitals, our transport and our police on their knees, and public finances that are in tatters. And it does mean that an incoming Labour government is not going to be able to do everything we want as quickly as possible. The Conservatives tried last year a whole load of unfunded tax cuts, and we saw the mess that got them in. And that's why I've been absolutely clear that there'll be nothing in our manifesto that is not fully costed and fully funded. We do recognise that means there are good Labour things that we would want to do that we won't be able to do as quickly as possible, but better that approach than the Tory approach of crushing the economy. In the answer to the final question around fiscal devolution, of course, if we're going to give local authorities and regional leaders and mayors and national leaders more power, then the money needs to go with that. You can't devolve skills and transport and housing, etc., without the money. But I'm also mindful that we now have the highest tax burden in Britain for more than 70 years. And so I set out some of the tax loopholes that we would close in government, non-DOMs, private schools, private equity. I've taken people through this morning what we would do around asking those with the broadest shoulders, the energy companies, to pay more in tax. But I'm not minded to go into the next election promising a whole load of tax increases or tax raising powers at a time when working people are struggling with the cost of living and taxes being at a record high too. Thank you.
Would you join me in thanking Rachel once again?
Thank you. Thanks very much.